Earlier this morning, President Obama addressed the state of Hurricane Matthew from the Oval Office alongside FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate.
What we're seeing now is Matthew having moved above South Florida and some of the largest population centers, working its way north. And the big concern that people are having right now is the effects that it could have in areas like Jacksonville on through Georgia. And although we've seen some significant damage in portions of South Florida, I think the bigger concern at this point is not just hurricane force winds, but storm surge. Many of you will remember Hurricane Sandy, where initially people thought this doesn't look as bad as we thought, and then suddenly you get massive storm surge and a lot of people were severely affected. And so I just want to emphasize to everybody that this is still a really dangerous hurricane, that the potential for storm surge, flooding, loss of life, and severe property damage continues to exist, and people continue to need to follow the instructions of their local officials over the course of the next 24, 48, 72 hours.
And FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate, good enough to join us on this busiest of days for you. With regard then to the briefing itself, Craig, what exactly was it that you shared with the president, and really what were his immediate concerns?
Well, I think because we've been watching the storm now for several days, I wanted to show them that the impacts further south from probably about Daytona Beach south have not been as severe because the storm did stay further out. But we're starting to see the really bad impacts now in that Daytona Beach area, moving up into St. Augustine and ultimately Jacksonville. But we also had a lot of concerns still for Georgia, South Carolina, and now with the 11 o'clock advisory, a hurricane warning all the way to North Carolina. And I think that's really what he has been concerned about, is that sometimes we always focus on the wind event. He's also wanting to make sure everybody understands the real risk here is the water event, storm surge, and that people need to be paying attention to that. And if you look down at South Florida and say, hey, it wasn't too bad down there, well, that's because they weren't expected to get the brunt of this storm, and where this storm is going now is under that threat.
And so because also this storm, you know, the average citizens, the average residents of the states in question here went to bed last night, it was a Category 4, they woke up and they see Category 3, and perhaps that comes with a certain set of assumptions, particularly for those who do live in the areas currently targeted. With regard then to the surge event, we've heard numbers of 10 feet plus. Certainly the waves would be on top of that. What exactly is the potential damage that comes with that surge in these areas?
Well, you got to remember, that's the surge. Then depending upon is it high tide, and then you got to look at wave action on top of that. So it can be everything into water getting into homes to crashing waves destroying buildings right along coastal areas, inlets, and rivers. And once you get up around Jacksonville with the St. Johns River all the way up into the Carolinas, this is an area that is very flat. You got the Sea Islands, and they have not had this kind of hurricane threat. So people focus on the center of the storm. This is not a center storm. This is a very broad area of risk with heavy rains and storm surge. And it's close enough now that even though it may have weakened, it is still a dangerous storm. And remember, Hurricane Sandy had weakened, became a post-tropical storm. People did not think the storm surge would be that great, and yet that was the #1 cause of damage from Sandy, was that storm surge.
In fact, we did hear Florida Governor Rick Scott say that we're only roughly halfway through this hurricane event right now. What did you make of preparation efforts, particularly calls to evacuate? We heard very dire warnings from Governor Scott through the last few days, but it seems initially perhaps that the frequency and urgency of those warnings were certainly effective.
Well, I think so. You know, we were looking at social media and how people were describing the storm, and people have been taking the storm very serious. And we know not everybody left, but we know a lot of people did heed those evacuations. That makes it a much easier job for the responders. The less time we're having to focus on life safety, the quicker we can get to the recovery operations and get communities back on their feet. So it's really the people that leave. They're as much as part of this as the ones that, as how we're going to be successful, because the fact they choose to leave and leave in time makes the whole job easier at the local level to respond to this.
We heard Governor Scott also say that National Guard assets had actually been moved from South Florida, thought perhaps to at least be initially out of harm's way, into central and northern Florida. What sort of flexibility does that effort entail?
Well, Governor Scott's been focused on Florida, so as South Florida has not been hit hard, he's able to shift resources and literally following the storm up and coming in from Central Florida. We basically have an arc of resources all the way from Fort Bragg up in North Carolina, all the way south down to Orlando. So pretty much we're able to do the same thing. As the storm moves north, we can now begin getting into the areas that were hit, assess, determine what assistance the states are going to need, but at the same time keeping an eye on what's about to happen into Georgia, into South Carolina, into North Carolina. I think we cannot emphasize that enough. We talk a lot about Florida, but this storm still got a ways to go, and those states are in the path of the storm, and they need to rush to preparation. They're going to run out of time.
Indeed, as this storm again pushes through the Space Coast, arrives to Jacksonville. You mentioned it. We've spoken this morning, Craig, to people, folks in Savannah, Georgia, who were heeding evacuation warnings. We have seen Governor Haley in South Carolina sound dire herself in describing especially what impact this will have on the coastal communities of her state. So next efforts in the next hour, 2 hours, 3 hours for you and for those regions, what's most important?
Most important thing is people that are still able to leave, heed those evacuation orders. And those areas that are now under the full brunt of the storm is hunker down, stay safe. But Governor Scott has his teams, the Florida National Guard, a lot of local and first responders that I used to work with. They're not going to wait for the winds. They're not going to wait for the sun to shine. As soon as it's safe, they're moving into these areas. So this will be a rapid response as the storm moves through, but we are limited to the speed of the storm. We can't get in areas that are still under hurricane force conditions, but those areas north can still evacuate, but they're going to run out of time, and time is not something we're going to get back.
Well, from initial reports and certainly our vantage point, certainly a remarkable response effort. FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate on so very busy a day. We very much appreciate your time.
Thank you.